Great, so we're recording. So welcome back, 2021, thinking about your community safety and well-being plan. Today we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to do some updates. So we've got an update on the deadline for submission of the plan, so we'll talk about that. I'm going to remind you about the process and sort of where we have been and the work that we've done, which will lead to where we're going to focus today, and I'm going to walk you through the results from the general public survey, so you can get a peek at those. And then I want to have a chat with you about the advisory committee working session that we have coming up next week, and talk a little bit about the process and what that might look like and sort of where we go from here in terms of developing the plan. So that's sort of where we're headed over the course of the morning. So I'm going to pull up my slide deck for you. All right, so if you haven't already heard, there's a new deadline for submission of the plan. So previously it was due January 1st, 2021, which is about 13 days ago. But in the COVID-19 Support and Protection Act, which was passed earlier this year, that act gave the Solicitor General the authority to set a new deadline. So the new deadline for municipalities to prepare and adopt a community safety and wellbeing plan is now July 1st, 2021. So it's about a 6-month extension on the plan. We'll have no problem meeting that deadline. We're sort of in good stead in terms of moving toward it. What it means is that our plan will have to be finalized and approved by each municipal council prior to July 1st. So I think we're in good stead in terms of meeting that deadline. So the other piece I wanted to do just before we jump into the general public survey results is to remind you of where we've been in the process. So if you remember, sort of like a 4-phase process. So we started earlier in 2020 with some kickoff meetings. So we did a kickoff meeting with you as the coordinating committee. We then hit shut down. If you remember, early April, we were supposed to have an in-person advisory committee meeting. We didn't. So instead, we did an introductory email to the project, and we did a video to introduce the advisory committee to the project. And just as a reminder, the advisory committee is really any agency, organization, individual who wants to be involved in the plan. So we've got a lot of people on that list. Then we moved into phase 2. So we have a data package that's available around all of our community safety and wellbeing sort of indicators and elements. We also did an inventory of existing planning tables. Then we spent a lot of time in phase 3, which is the community engagement. So as part of that, we had an online discussion forum with the advisory committee. We did an advisory committee survey. We then did a data walk session with the advisory committee where we took sort of the top pieces that came out of the survey and walked through the data around them, did some sense making and contextualizing of that. And then the big focus sort of over end of the summer into the fall has been the general public survey, which we're going to talk about today. And then I have also had interviews with OHT to make sure we're aligning with their work, as well as the Elgin Community Foundation. So it's sort of been what our community engagement process has looked like. That is getting us ready for that phase 4 piece, which is the plan development. So that's where we will identify the priority risks or areas that we want to have included in the community safety and wellbeing plan. We'll identify the strategies that will be put in place to move them forward, along with sort of leads and how and what that will look like, with some measurable outcomes, and then a performance measurement framework. So those pieces in that last box for phase 4 are the mandated pieces that the province would like to see as part of the community safety and wellbeing plan. Other than that, it's sort of up to us to decide what we would like that plan to look like. So that's where we have been along our journey since about March of last year. And as I said, I think we've made good headway. Even with the pandemic, people have been really responsive in terms of engaging in online and virtual vehicles for engagement. So just a reminder as we think about community safety and wellbeing, and you'll see this when we look at the results from the survey, is as we think about the plan, we want to think about those sort of 4 concentric circles. making sure that we're thinking from everything from incident response, which is sort of reactive responses by fire, EMS, police, right through out to that green circle, which is the social development circle, which focuses more on things like your social determinants of health or quality of life, like poverty, housing, food security, and other pieces like that. So it's just a reminder to get you back and thinking about the project. So I'm going to jump in unless there are any questions so far. No, not seeing any. Okay, so let's talk about the general public survey. So it was opened sort of the end of July. We decided to run it through to December 4th to see how large of a response we could get. Did really well. You have 429 responses, which is really great. The thing I always look at is that confidence interval. I always like it to be at least a 5. You're at a 4.72, which is great. It's lower than a 5. So the confidence interval speaks to how generalizable the results of the survey are, how confident you can be in the results of the survey. So what that means at a 4.72 is if we had 80% of people say they agree with a question, the range would be either 4.72 below or 4.72 higher. So 80%, it could range sort of from a 75.3% to an 84.7%. So it's a nice tight range in terms of the confidence interval around responses to the question. So really great on that. If we take a look at the screen, you'll see the percent of responses by municipality. You'll see a blue arrow pointing at BAM. BAM had a smaller number of responses. I want to say it was 4. It was small. So you'll notice in the analysis that I have removed any analysis from BAM just due to the small numbers. I always say we use caution with it because you can sometimes identify people who responded when you get such a slow response. So you'll see that BAM hasn't been included when I break it down into a look at municipalities. So let's take a look at the demographic profile. So a high percentage of female, which I've done the surveying in 2 other communities as well for community safety and well-being. High level female response rate in the other communities as well. So 78.5% were female, 20.3 male, and 0.8 identified as other. We also asked about the age, and you'll see that we are looking at them by generation. So we can actually note if there are any differences in terms of generational perceptions around community safety and well-being. So again, the only small one was Generation Z, which would be young, so 17 or younger, very small proportion. So again, those have been removed from the analysis of the survey. But other than that, we've got a pretty good proportion between your millennials, your Gen X, and your baby boomers responding to the survey. So this slide, again, shows you some of those different demographic pieces. So in terms of subpopulations, this shows you the absolute number. So again, you'll see some, I say any that are sort of 10 or less, we wouldn't be looking at using, but you certainly have a good number with 40 saying you have persons living with a disability, persons living in poverty, and then a sexual minority sitting at 11. Education level, for the most part, the majority of people had a high school education or higher, so into the post-secondary, with some post-secondary at college and trade or at university. Employment, majority of people were employed, though you did have some unemployed and retired, and again, a very small number of students responding to the survey. And again, in terms of annual household income, a nice cross-section there across the 4 different, certainly the smaller group being less than 30, but you do have a good cross-section sort of between that 30,000 to 100,000 and over. So that's your demographic profile. So when we go into the survey itself, just to remind you, we asked about 20 different elements of community safety and well-being that you see on the screen. And we asked people, so we provided people with a description of the element so they knew what it was. And then we asked them a series of questions about it. So we asked them to rate the impact of that element on themselves as an individual and people living in their household. So more of an individual look. We asked them to rate the impact of the element on the municipality in which they lived. So if they lived in Central Elgin, they'd be focusing on that. And then we asked them to rate the impact of the element more broadly on Elgin County, so the whole geographic area as a whole. We also asked them to tell us what priority they felt that element should play in the community safety and well-being plan. And they were able to rate that on a slider scale of 0 to 10, 0 being a very low priority in the community safety and well-being plan, and 10 being a very high priority in the community safety and well-being plan. And then we did a follow-up question where we asked them why they sort of rated it where they did between 0 to 10 in terms of what priority they felt it should be in the community safety and well-being plan. By using that kind of structure, it gave us the ability to actually compare the elements based on how people rated it in terms of the priorities. And that's what you will see on this slide. So you'll see the orange bar with the number at the end of it is the average score out of 10. So everybody's scores went together. They were then averaged for each of the issues in terms of what level of priority people thought it should play in the community safety and well-being plan. So you'll see quite a range, with mental health issues sitting at the top of the list with an average score of 8.40 out of 10, down to your lowest one, which was street violence and gang issues, at a 5.84 in terms of its weighting of a priority out of 10. So certainly you'll see in these, the ones that sort of float to the top in terms of the average score, in terms of people thinking what priority it should be. So mental health issues sitting at top, education and skills development in second. Right behind it, you have substance use and addiction, criminal activity, housing security, and then employment at a 7.28 out of 10. So those are the top elements from your general public survey. Then what I did is looked at it by municipality, because that was overall county. You'll notice, especially if some municipality is more highly populated and had more respondents to survey, they would carry more weight in terms of certain elements. So you'll see I've highlighted in yellow the top 6 that came out overall across the county. And then you'll see which of those showed up in each of the municipalities. So of course, St. Thomas is showing up in all 6. They do carry that weight in terms of number of responses in the survey as well as population. You'll see in Elmer that 5 of the 6 showed up. Central Elgin is showing up in there as well with none below. Then you'll start to see a few differences. So Dutton Dunwich as a municipality only had 2 in the top 6, and then they also had internet access and digital literacy, physical health issues, and discrimination, marginalization, and racism show up in their top list from the municipality. Malahide had 4, and then also had internet access and digital literacy and physical health issues. Southold had the same as the overall. West Elgin had 2, so criminal activity and housing security, and then had 4 that sat out in their top list. So internet access and digital literacy, financial security, social environment, and food security. So then in the final column, you'll see how many municipalities that element showed up in terms of their top list. So you'll see a couple here that I'm going to flag later on as sort of potential areas we may want to look at. So remember when we first started talking about, you're doing a shared community safety and well-being plan. So there could be elements or priorities that apply to all of sort of Elmer, Elgin, St. Thomas, and then there could be priorities that may apply just to a municipality or a couple of municipalities, depending on what's showing up in the municipality. So that's what this table does, is sort of shows you where we're seeing some congruence or alignment around what are some of those critical issues for community safety and well-being from the public's perception, and where there are some potential differences across some of your municipalities. So I'm going to stop there just for a second. Are there any questions or comments, any surprises around sort of what's showing up in your top list? Thoughts on that? Sort of any surprises? Again, thinking public perception around community safety and well-being. Anything surprise you on those?
Not for us, Jennifer. I'm not surprised by that ranking for St. Thomas at all. given the social related issues and the criminal fallout we have as a result.
Yeah. Anyone else? Comments on the top list?
From a county's perspective, the distance and the access to services seems to be obviously something that's sticking out for us.
Yeah, and you'll see that when we get into sort of the comments around why people rated things as a priority or not in terms of the being included in the plan. Any other comments or questions about sort of that top list? I got to tell you, it's interesting because I've also did Middlesex's, and we did their presentation yesterday. Their top list is very different than yours, which I love because it's actually showing that difference in communities in terms of what their perception is around community safety and well-being. All right, so let's go back here. So then what I want to show you before we jump into looking at the top sort of elements that the public identified for the plan is to show you what the general public sort of picked as their top pieces that they'd like to see focused on for community safety well-being, and what we saw from our community partners. Remember, we did that survey last year as well. So we are seeing some similarities. So we've got mental health issues in the general public. Mental health issues showed up from your community partner list. I put education, skills development, employment, which I think link with regional economy, which was a piece that showed up from community partners. Substance use and addiction you're seeing as well. And then housing security showing up. And then the one that didn't though, so general public picked up on criminal activity, which is not showing up on your community partner list, but on your partner list, you also have poverty and income security, which didn't show up on your general public. So a lot of alignment between sort of public perception around what they would like to see in terms of community safety well-being and what your community partners are reflecting what they're seeing in the community as well. Any comments on that or questions about that? That's just helping. So I put that as a visual because I'm going to show you at the end, if you remember, when we start to think about building your community safety and well-being plan, there's all of these pieces of the puzzle. So data is one piece. So what does data tell us about our community? What do our community partners know about our community? What does the public think in terms of perception about community safety and well-being? And we have to begin to put them all together as we think about what will be those priorities and strategies that you want to include in your community safety and well-being plan. So what I'm going to do is walk you through each of the top elements from the public perception, just to give you a sense of why they felt each should be a priority in the community safety and well-being plan. So we had mental health issues sort of sitting as the top element to be included from the public perception. It got the top overall average rating of 8.40 out of 10. And then in terms of it sitting in the different municipalities, it was identified in the top list of 5 of the municipalities. So St. Thomas, Elmer, Central Elgin, Malahide, and Southwold all identified it as well in their top list. So when we look at the comments around why the public felt mental health should be a priority, it's an interesting piece. The public on your survey was very astute at making connections between the elements. So knowing that they don't stand alone, but really looking at how they are interrelated with each other. So they felt that mental health was a key foundational piece in community safety and well-being. Certainly a lot of people talked about COVID-19 and the pandemic and how that has exacerbated mental health and well-being across communities. They made, as I said, that linkage between mental health. So they talked about sort of that far-reaching impact of it, where they talked about it, mental health and homelessness being connection, mental health being connected with poverty, with addiction, with crime, with employment, with domestic violence. So they felt it was had a large impact if it was focused on in the community safety and well-being plan. Some people talked about this still being a stigma associated with mental health. Some talked about the closing of the psychiatric hospital and how that's had an impact on mental health in the region. And then also talked about the need for access to education about mental health and the need for more professionals and resources, especially in rural areas, and that using the police as a primary or first response to supporting individuals with mental health is a challenge in terms of thinking about how you support people who have mental health issues. So that's why people felt it should be included in the community safety and well-being plan. So potential areas they talked about that could be focused. So again, as we think about sort of strategies for this, they talked certainly about mental health of children and youth being an area that should be focused on. They talked about focusing on prevention, focusing on the LGBTQ+ community. They talked a lot about a lot of examples of sort of the visibility of individuals with mental health issues, specifically in the downtown core of St. Thomas. Some people talked about sort of the perceived threat to their own safety or the fear they had around seeing and experiencing these individuals in downtown St. Thomas. They also made that link saying an area to focus on could be housing options for individuals with mental health issues and having available and affordable supports, resources, and services, and then specifically named geographic areas where they felt there was a need for more mental health supports, resources, and services, and those being the western part of Elgin County, and then thinking more rural in terms of rural areas and small towns. And then talked again sort of about that integration piece and providing wraparound care for individuals with mental health issues. So that's sort of the thoughts of the public around where the need or sort of gaps or focus could be around community safety, well-being, and when you're thinking about mental health and well-being. So the second overall element that was identified was education and skills development. So this got an average rating of 7.89 out of 10. It was identified in the top list of elements in 6 of the municipalities. So it showed up in St. Thomas, Elmer, Central Elgin, Dutton Dunwich, Malahide, and Southold. So again, in terms of comments around why people thought it should be a priority, you'll see the first one, there were no major themes around sort of what should be the focus, or if you were thinking about increasing education and skills development, but people really talked about sort of that general overall importance of education as sort of being that cornerstone or a foundational piece in society. They made the linkages between education and skills development and employment, economic well-being, the health of people, people's social skills, decreased crime. So I think for because there were no big themes, to me, it was more that people saw this as an important element that actually supports some of those other community safety and well-being elements. Some comments did note, though, that we need to be thinking about supporting all abilities when we think about education skills development, that it needs to be culturally sensitive, support diversity, and focus on anti-discrimination. And then sort of thinking more broadly, not just sort of education for kids or children, but thinking about the importance of life skills training, skills training for jobs, and lifelong learning were also mentioned. And then there were a few comments around lack of school resources in West Elgin, and that children had to come into sort of the central part in St. Thomas to actually access some of the school resources. So that's why people felt education and skills development should be included in the community safety and well-being plan. So the third element that came on the list was substance use and addiction. This was right behind so education and skills development was 7.89 out of 10. This is 7.88 out of 10 in terms of its average rating. It was named in 4 out of the 7 municipalities in terms of their top list. So St. Thomas, Central Elgin, Elmer, and Southold named this in their top list. So people talked about sort of the increasing use and prevalence of substance use and addiction, specifically, again, talking about St. Thomas and in the core of the city. Lots of comments about concerns with discarded needles being found on the ground, growing overdose or opioid crisis. And then again, linkages were made between this element, so substance use and addiction, some of those other community safety and well-being elements, such as mental health, housing and homelessness, and crime. So again, I'm saying you're seeing how the public is seeing the interrelatedness of these different community safety and well-being elements. Just like mental health, people talked about there being a stigma attached to addictions and that public education should be a focus around that. Talked about the lack of services, supports, and resources, specifically in smaller or rural communities. And then a number of ideas came up, or solutions for more services. People talked about either a safe injection or a safe consumption site, more treatment programs, and a rehabilitation center as being sort of potential services that could be put in place. Criminal activity was number 4 on the overall list. It was actually tied with substance use and addiction at 7.88 out of 10 in terms of its overall rating. It showed up on the top list of 5 of the municipalities. So St. Thomas, Central Elgin, Southold, Malahide, and West Elgin all had criminal activity in their top lists. Again, similar to the piece around education and skills development, there was this sort of overall theme that people want to feel safe where they live, so that was very important to them. And that's why this showed up as a higher priority in terms of that list of 20 different elements. St. Thomas was again named more frequently as a community with more criminal activity. People talked though about criminal activity not being like major or serious crimes, but more like break-ins, petty theft, property theft. People talked a lot about like vehicle break-ins, drug use, drug trafficking, animal cruelty came up a number of times, and human trafficking. So again, this was linked to other elements. So a lot felt that criminal activity was more a symptom of something versus being the root cause of it, and that the root cause may actually lie in some of those other community safety and well-being elements we talked about, like mental health, addiction, poverty, food security, unemployment, housing, homelessness, social inclusion, or a sense of belonging, and or education. So people are making that link that criminal activity is not the root cause, but as we think about our community safety and well-being plan, are there some of those other elements that if they were focused on may actually reduce some of the criminal activity? But again, noting not serious crime, but more sort of that petty theft, property theft, vehicle break-in kind of things were named. So the next one on the list was housing security. So this was rated number 5 overall. So 7.80 out of 10 was the average rating. It was identified on the top list of 3 of the municipalities. So St. Thomas, Elmer, and West Elgin talked about housing security. So again, housing was named as one of those foundational components by the public in terms of addressing some of the other community safety and well-being elements. People talked about a number of sort of issues or concerns. A lack of affordable housing was talked about. Homelessness issue, especially St. Thomas was named. Unsafe housing, sort of the lack of availability or a low vacancy rate of rental housing. A lack of rental property in rural Elgin. Too much focus on building condos or houses that are expensive to purchase. So again, going into sort of that affordability of what's being built in Elmer, Elgin, St. Thomas. In terms of populations that have more vulnerability in the area of housing security, youth, seniors, and persons with disabilities were named by the public. And then people also talked about the need for a range of diverse housing options, including that increased supply of affordable rental housing. And people talked about focus on housing first as an approach to homelessness. So those are the pieces that people talked about when they were identifying why housing security should be a focus in the overall community safety and well-being plan. So then the final item on the top list, and you'll see you have a top 6 list because your top ones were fairly close in terms of that average rating. So here you've got employment with a average rating of 7.77 out of 10. This element was identified in the top list of 6 of the municipalities. So it was identified in St. Thomas, Dunwich, Central Elgin, Elmer, Southold, and Malahide. So again, employment was named as one of those underlying factors that was key in terms of quality of life and overall wellness. It was linked again to other community safety and well-being elements. In terms of what people were focusing on, they said some people are working multiple jobs to make ends meet. They felt that paying a living wage was very important. And some of the public also talked about COVID-19 having an impact locally with businesses closing and sort of the resulting job losses that you're seeing in the community. So again, a lot of comments around sort of that, the importance of employment overall around quality of life. And then in terms of the focus, more I would think around precarious employment in terms of people working multiple jobs and living wage being sort of the main aspects, which is what you're seeing here. So precarious work. People also named transportation, so the ability to get to jobs from outlying towns. They talked about the skills match between available jobs and the skills that individuals have who are looking for work. A number of people talked about the fact that they are commuting to work in other municipalities because they can't find a job in their local community that matches their skills or profession. And then, as I said, that need for fair wages or a living wage. And a few people also mentioned guaranteed basic income in terms of some of the main issues around employment. So those were the top 6 in terms of the overall average rating that they got out of 10. As I showed you, though, in that table, looking at some of the elements across municipalities that didn't show up in the top list, internet access and digital literacy showed up in the top list in 3 out of 7 municipalities, so Dutton, Dunwich, Malahide, and West Elgin. And then physical health issues showed up on the top list for Dutton, Dunwich, and Malahide. So I've included them, especially as we begin to work with the advisory committee of other potential elements we may want to think of. And it may be specific to those municipalities and or it could be a broader sort of piece. So I'm going to stop that just for a minute and see where we're at. So any sort of comments or questions around that, the top list or those top issues or the comments that we heard from the public? Yeah, Steve.
As we go forward with this, what happens to when you showed the large list of all the elements? You've identified the top 6 here. What happens to all those other ones going forward? Do they just get knocked off, or how do they play a role in the development of the final plan?
It's a great question. I don't know. I think it's, so that's, to me, that's the discussion, because it's so interesting. I think the public was very, I said, they were very astute because they know everything is interconnected. So even though something may not have shown up in the top 6 list, it may impact some of the things that are in the top 6 list. And as I said, I'm going to show you in a minute that puzzle piece. This is where it gets into the dialogue and the sense making of it, because there's no one right answer, but it's sort of looking at everything together and saying, what do we want to focus on? And one of the things I wanted to chat with you today is, what length of time do you want your community safety and well-being plan to be? Is it a 3-year plan? Is it a 5-year plan? Is it a 10-year plan? Because that will also help inform how much gets into the plan in terms of what you want to focus on. There isn't, I mean, as you know, there's no money attached directly to implementation of it. So as a community, as a coordinating committee, we have to talk about, what does that look like in terms of putting it together? And what does it look like in terms of putting a structure to implement it? And how do we think about implementing it from a resource perspective? But yeah, it doesn't take them off the table. That was a great question. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
My second comment would be, the city has recently completed a strategic plan. The county of Elgin has recently completed a strategic plan. And, you know, I think there's a lot of common elements, and I'm not saying to fudge the answers, but how do we make sure that everything is all aligned together, that, you know, what the priority is, the priority elements are here. How do we ensure that they tie in with the respective strategic plans of the municipalities? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great role for you as a coordinating committee. It's interesting. I was working with Middlesex yesterday, and it's their CAOs that sit sort of on this list. And we were talking about that as well. And they were seeing good alignment with sort of the top issues, because when we get into sort of the implementation of the community safety and wellbeing plan, we want to align the work that you're already doing into it, because you are. I mean, as municipalities, that's your job, is to respond to community needs. So you're already doing a lot of it. So to me, that's sort of the litmus test of this group. Is your advisory committee is going to do some work around what they think should be in the community safety and well-being plan. I think you bring a different perspective and a different sort of contextual piece to it, which is thinking about it in terms of how it aligns with some of the other pieces that you're leading in your communities. And we want to make sure that that's reflected and we're seeing that alignment in it as well. Are you seeing alignment in it? Like if you think about the strategic plans in your communities with some of the top things we're hearing so far around community safety and well-being, or even think from like a police perspective in terms of what you're focusing on. Yeah, Julie.
I can see that there's 4 out of 6 that are directly noted in Elgin County Council's strategic plan. The 2 that are not explicitly noted are addictions and criminal activity.
Yeah, you know, though, and to me, the one piece that we also have to keep in mind is that this is a community safety and well-being plan. So it's not just up to municipalities to drive the implementation. So that's where we also have to look to community partners to say, how are community partners willing to come together to focus on addictions? How do we set up a structure to make sure that happens? Because not everything falls underneath the purview of a municipality in terms of what you're going to see around community safety and well-being. Chris, did you want to say something? Nope. So let me go back to, what do you think about length of time for the plan? Thoughts on that? Because that'll help us, we think about scope, right? What goes in. Yeah, Julie?
Just to get the conversation going, I think 5 years might be too long. I think 3 years kind of gives us a good starting point where you have enough actionable items included in that plan to then, after the 3-year mark, check back with the community and make sure that all of the priority areas are still relevant.
Great. Other thoughts? Length of the plan? Steve, did you want to say something?
I would echo Julie's comments that, you know, I think we need to have some short-term and some longer-term initiatives. But to me, the key one in this, not key, but is who's going to pay for all of this stuff. And I think because much of what's been identified here are not historically municipal responsibilities. You know, there's a lot of healthcare related items in here. And I know we've had many a discussion around our table at City Hall about how we're being asked to participate and pay for more and more health related items. And I think we have to find a way to push back at if the province wants us to do these things, the province needs to come to the table with the funding to help implement these. And some of them are quite, in my opinion, you know, the mental health stuff is beyond the mandate of what we do as a municipality. And so we've got to stress back that if these things, if the province wants us to implement these plans, they need to come to the table to assist in making that.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I know some communities are saying even it'll get you ready to apply for funding. So if grants open up, that you'll have sort of the background to be able to apply. But I agree, there's no funding around implementation, even around the structure to help move it forward in terms of implementation. Who resources moving it forward in your community?
Jennifer.
Oh,
Go ahead. Okay, I was just going to, all I was going to say is the mental health one. The hospital had been working quite hard to increase the number of psychiatrists, et cetera. And I know the police have been working with, at least the OPP have been working with taking someone with them that knows how to deal with mental health issues when they get calls, because I know a lot of their calls deal with mental health issues. So they've already been working on those things. I realize all we're doing is, you know, I mean, we're trying to advise, and the whole thing is to coordinate this. And I like the idea of short term, but I also like the idea of a way to measure how successful we're being. because I think that's very important too. There's no point putting all this in place. And at the end of 3 years, you don't know if you've achieved anything in any of the areas. And I think we need to look at some form of measurement as well.
Great, thanks, Sally. Wendell.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry I was a bit late. I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but, and picking up on Councillor Peters' point around the health issues, like there's such a connect with this and the work of the Ontario Health Team and the development of that plan locally. If you put them side by side, there's a lot of mirroring up. And at some point in time, somebody's got to take a concerted effort of putting these teams side by side and seeing, okay, where does this fall and who's going to do what relating to the health pieces.
I did talk to the Ontario Health Team consultant, and I'll follow up because they were going to have a full application by December, though their year one focus was patients with COPD or other related respiratory issues. So they had a very specific focus for year one. So in terms of sort of overall alignment initially, it certainly wasn't there, though we did talk about the potential for aligning sort of the planning process, because they're taking more of a population health approach, which is what community safety and well-being is. It's part of looking more broadly at your population. So I think, especially as you think about implementation and moving it into the future, there could be some good alignment with that table for sure in that team.
Well, it just seems weird to me that if in that, and I know that they've identified the COPD thing, and then on that, which is a broad community-based plan, and then in this one on a broad community thing, we're saying no, it's mental health, and then to Councillor Peters' perspective, okay, where's the money coming from? Because they're both health-related thing, and you go to the Ontario Health Team, well, we're not touching that because it's not our number one priority. Like that's where the disconnect is in this whole thing, in my mind.
Yeah, it's like you have concurrent planning going on that's not talking to each other.
Right.
Yeah. How are people feeling about a 3-year plan?
Just one comment, Jennifer, as far as not speaking to each other. I know Julie sits on both the Ontario Health Team one and this. So there are people that are on both. I hear about the Ontario Health Team because I'm on the hospital board. So I hear about what they're doing and I get updates, almost weekly or whatever when any new changes occur. So it's important that we do coordinate and work together.
Yeah, go ahead, Wendell.
Yeah, if I may, I also sit on that team. And believe you me, I'm saying the same thing when I'm sitting at that table too.
Yeah.
But it's just not as cohesive as I think it could or should be. But.
Yeah, and just further, if I may, Jennifer, through further to Wendell's point, we did see that item number 6 identified by the community was primary care.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that the community did point out that there needs to be a link.
Yeah, I think as we move toward finalizing your plan, I think there probably needs to be some discussion or dialogue with that group, both around sort of aligning your work and around how do you move forward, and is it moving forward together? Because you don't want to set up separate tables or committees or groups to move things forward if you all have the same primary focus. Yeah, that's a key. All right, so let me go back 3 years. Is 3 years length of time for the plan? People okay with that? Noting I also heard we want some sort of short-term pieces and we want some longer term. And in your 3-year plan, it could be we start exploring how we focus on something where you won't actually get to completing it by the end of 3 years, because there could be some longer term pieces that you actually want to start looking at. So yes, 3 years. Okay, thank you. All right, so let me just show you back to, okay, so this is, I keep talking about the puzzle. Here is the puzzle. So this is sort of where we're heading to, where there's not one road to get to your community safety and wellbeing plan, but it's taking all these pieces. So we've got the data package we've collected. There's lots of local research that's happening. We want to look at what's already in place in terms of strategies and initiatives, which is that local asset mapping. We want to look at what did your community partners identify as sort of the top issues, challenges, and or risks. We've got your general public survey now, which tells us the public's perceptions around community safety and well-being. And then we're going to be working in that gray. So that's the advisory committee session where we start. So what I'm going to do in the advisory committee is show them the work that we did on the general public survey, and then begin to talk about what's the process we want to undertake to start making sense of everything, because we do have all of these pieces. It's a matter of what's the weighting of each of them, what do they mean, what do we focus on or not focus on, going back to Steve's question, we've got the list of 20, is it only these 6 we're focusing on, but sort of having that dialogue and discussion, and what does that process look like. So that's the session next Friday. We've already got 50 people registered to attend, which is great, so a good number of people coming. As I said, we're going to do sort of what's similar to what I did with you today, where I'll walk them through the results from the general public survey. I'll have them do some initial sort of what do they think about it? What do they think about it vis-a-vis what they heard from the community partner survey and some of the other things they've talked about, and then begin to talk about what's the process we want to take to begin to identify some of those priority risks and strategies for the community safety and well-being plan. I want to talk to them about the process because it's a very large group, and doing it online, I want to figure out what's sort of the right way to actually approach that. And then knowing, I don't want to get them to the point where it's sort of carved in stone, but then at what point we bring you in to do some of that looking and providing your context to what's there as well, and some of the comments that you might have around what you want to see in the plan. So it's sort of where we're headed next, though, is they'll get a similar presentation today, but we'll do more dialogue around what they're seeing and what it might mean as we think about the community safety and well-being plan. So that's where we're headed with that. Any comments or tips or questions about working with the advisory committee next week? No. Nope. So that's all I had for you today. So are there any other sort of comments or questions, or any comments around sort of your involvement? Because now we're starting, after we do this presentation with the advisory committee, we're going to start to actually begin to build and do the work around what should be in the community safety and well-being plan. So any thoughts around that piece of it that you already have in your head? I've heard we need to think about alignment with your municipal strategic plans, sort of a key piece around that. We need to think about the link with your Ontario health team. The other question I had is your, and I don't know if I'm gonna get the name right, Community Leaders Cabinet, community, is that what it's called? Is that still in existence? No, okay.
No, but we do have the membership list, so we could, if needed, work with the health unit to reestablish it, some form of, or fashion.
I just wondered, because when I was looking at the existing planning tables, it was on that list. And because I was looking at the existing planning tables to say, oh gosh, if you did identify mental health and well-being as a top, is there a table that may actually take it and run with it for you? Like who could actually move stuff into implementation? Because you do have a lot of existing planning tables. You've got a youth homelessness, you've got one that focuses on women and homelessness, you've got an addictions table. Like there could be certain tables that already exist that would be willing to take the lead on some pieces in your plan. But sort of in terms of that overall lead, that's what I was wondering if that group was around. But we also heard the Ontario Health Team could be a potential spot too. But maybe that's a good homework for you, is sort of start to think about, I'm not gonna say
One other,
yeah,
hi
go ahead,
Jennifer,
Kelly.
just one other thing. There is a rural education task force that the board of the Thames Valley Board are doing. I happen to sit on
Okay.
it. And they're looking at schools in rural areas, and it might be worth touching base with some of them. They did a thought exchange, which they had, almost 1,500 people take part in on what they want to see in rural schools and what skills, etc. And you know, changes to funding formulas, et cetera, to keep rural high schools and rural elementary schools open with that sense of community, which certainly helps with the sense of mental well-being, et cetera, as well. So I'm just letting you know that that is going on as well, and we might want to touch base with them. Bonnie Williams would be the logical
Okay.
one. Arlene Moreau is the chair of it, but Bonnie Williams is the staff person who could put you in charge or in touch with the right people.
Great, thanks, Sally. Any other sort of initial thoughts you're having about as we think about moving into developing the plan? Julie?
So I think it's going to be important sooner rather than later to start thinking about what actionable items for a community safety and wellbeing plan might look like. Reasonable actionable items, just going back to Councillor Peters' point, which is, you know, we have to establish roles and responsibilities, and going back to Councillor Martin's point, opportunities for enhanced collaboration between existing planning tables and community agencies and or municipalities. It might be helpful to see some examples from some municipalities who have completed community safety and wellbeing plans, just to see what approach they've taken to this.
Yeah, and some are very high level where they just say we're going to focus on mental health and well-being, but some do drill. So yeah, that's a good point. I'll pull out some examples. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I had a conversation with Region Appeal, which is leading their community safety wellbeing plan. They actually have like I want to call it a secretariat, but they have like 5 staff dedicated to it. Their region put in, I think, $1 million to support it. I was like, holy smoke. So but that's the cost. Like, think about implementation. So I think in smaller areas like Elmer, Elgin, St. Thomas, we need to think more creatively around how do we move it forward. So are there existing vehicles that could move it forward? How do we get ourselves ready for grant applications to get some funding for it? So yeah, we need to think a little more creatively, I think, around how we move it to implementation.
And just one more point, I think it's going to be important to have a sense of the ongoing work for the coordinating committee and the advisory committee once the plan is developed. I think it will be important to know, you know, does our work end as soon as the plan is developed, and do we hand over a document to a different planning table like the community leaders cabinet or another group? So
yeah, and that's the piece I see this group sort of talking about. I call it the governance structure. So once the plan is done, so the governance structure we have right now is we've got you as the coordinating committee, we've got the advisory committee, and that's for the planning process. So once the plan is done, who takes it? What's the governance structure around implementation? That's why I said, is it the Ontario Health Team? Is it your community cabinet? Is it another coordinating committee? Is it you that continues around implementation? But that's the piece we need to think about. And then in terms of governance, is it you use existing planning tables or bodies in the community as sort of like subgroups that take on sort of different issues that are identified in your plan? But that's what you need to start thinking about, is what does that governance piece look like as you hand off from planning to implementation?
Mm-hmm. So there is a formalized role for municipalities to play in the approval of the community safety and wellbeing plan, which I think perhaps at some level speaks to our some expectations for municipalities to continue to lead the implementation or play a critical role there. But I'm just wondering, and this may be thinking too far out, but will we be seeking members of the advisory committee and their agencies and boards to endorse this plan in some sort of formal way?
That's a great question. Which is that community piece of it, right? Yeah. Thoughts on that? It's a great question.
Well, I agree with you, and I don't have an answer to the question Julie just asked, but we're going through an awful lot of work for it not to be given to someone to actually implement. If we're recognizing now that's not the case, well, then let's stop where we are. That doesn't make sense. We're planning work for a very large group. It may be us, but it may also be other people. And I think we need to, as sooner rather than later, start suggesting who's going to be doing what with the action plan we do. Many of the items that are on our wellness and safety action plan list are not truly municipal.
Yeah.
I mean, I can look through my budget all I want, and I don't find anything on healthcare or mental health. So wait, great. I see Mary nodding her head. Absolutely right. It just isn't in our wheelhouse. It isn't what we do. So I'd like to watch that over time, it certainly has happened to me a number of times where another group came and said, here's a bunch of stuff we think you should do. Right? I don't want to be that group that now says, smart people have looked at this and you should now implement it. And I don't know where you're getting your money from. Right. So yeah, there's going to be a transition from the design from where we are to even when we submit it will be finished, to then what does that mean? Who's doing what with it? I think a lot more conversation on that part of it needs to take place.
Yeah, that's why I pulled out your planning tables today, because I thought, oh, so let's say the advisory committee says, yeah, we think mental health and well-being should be one of the top things you look at. That's why I was looking to say, is there a planning table where then you could say to that planning table, okay, this has been identified through the process. You develop the strategies and tell us what you're going to focus on. Here's all the data and information, but instead of having the advisory committee develop it, we actually hand it off to a group that's already working in that area, because they should have the expertise around it. Like you have a living wage committee, you have a mental health advisory group, there's a housing and homelessness action group. Like there are groups that are already working in some of your the top areas that have shown up. Yeah, Julie.
So I'm wondering if for the meeting next week, whether it might be helpful to identify who the strategic partners are in each of those areas.
Yeah.
So identify a couple of agencies who are willing to step up and provide that level of detailed planning that you just identified.
Yeah. Because that's where I keep thinking, like the advisory committee is such a large group that doing the planning that way, and I'm not sure how much value added it will be versus if you actually have the tables and strategic partners that are already doing that work, do the work on our behalf. Yeah. And
it almost forces them to work collaboratively.
Yeah.
Which aligns with what the plan is trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So it's sort of like we set up a sub group or working groups to actually develop the plan. Yeah.
Or not.
Yeah.
Or not. I mean, if there is already something pretty close out there,
Yeah.
I'm kind of been picking them off one by one and saying, well, that's already there.
Yes.
Even if it's not doing work right now, it's already there. Julie mentioned the community leaders cabinet. You know, if this is a job that's big and that group wants, then great, but let's not reinvent another strategic planning group that's going to go out and tell other people what to do. Let's really, you're right, give it to those at this point that have some action in that area already, and see if the whole thing goes. I mean, you read off 3 or 4 different homeless groups.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I've ever seen them all in the same room, but we have them, right? So I agree. We need to start at this point saying this is coming. Now, who's doing?
Yeah. Yeah, and that could be a good piece with the advisory committee next week, as we say, this is who we've identified as sort of being strategic partners. Are there other ones that should be a part of the conversation as we move it into more of a working group? Look at it. Okay, that's very helpful. Other thoughts, comments?
I just have one more comment that I think Mayor Preston's idea contributes to a sense of ownership, which is critical at this point, where if they start directly contributing to the actions, then their agency or planning table then kind of owns part of the plan, and the responsibility doesn't just rest with the coordinating committee or a planning body that's far too large to actually execute.
Yeah, great. Great. Well, that's all I have for you today. Oh, so I'm going to suggest that we regroup after the advisory committee, just to sort of update you on where we're headed and what that looks like. So it'll probably be early Feb. Do you want to set a date while we're here? Would you like me to do a doodle? Now you're all looking at your calendars. Would you like me to do a doodle? Would you like to do it now?
I'm happy either way, but yeah,